Well, man, there's no mistake. You guys know how to worship. Come on. Come on, right? That was seriously, incredible. You guys know how to worship. Thank you so much. Such a gift to be here, honestly. I love it. You got that on there, buddy? You guys even brought out the disco ball tonight. Did you see that? Come on. That's a first for me. I don't know what it's like up here in Canada, but I think it was like spinning. Abba Anthony says, whoever hammers a lump of iron first decides what he is going to make of it. A scythe, a sword, or an axe. Even so, we ought to make up our minds about what kind of virtue we want to forge, or we labor in vain. If you were with us this morning, we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, all of it, all 3 chapters. Actually, we dipped a little bit into chapter 4 and chapter 8. And if you weren't here, I'm sorry you missed it. But I'm trying to persuade us with something. I'm trying to help us to think a little bit about the reality that what Jesus is doing, not just in the Sermon on the Mount, but is in his entire way of life, that what he's doing is he is intricately involved in inviting us to relinquish power and control and manipulation, because the most important thing in the kingdom and the thing that Jesus is up to is relationships. So think with me a little bit about the life of Jesus, that everywhere he goes and everywhere he turns, he's constantly engaged in this process of bringing people together and reaching out to people. Think about the demon-possessed man that they've chained at the edge of town. Nobody's going out there, nobody's present to that guy, and Jesus goes out and he frees him. And he brings him into the family and into the fold. Think about the Syrophoenician woman, the woman who is effectively a refugee. She's not quite fitting in, and she begs of Jesus, would you come and would you heal my daughter? And all the expectation around that environment would have been like, no way, man. Like, you don't get what is for these other people. And yet Jesus finds a way to make her the hero of that story. When little children want to come up to Jesus and people say, oh, no, don't, you can't get close to Jesus. Jesus says, no, it's okay. Just let him come. He's constantly engaged in this process of welcoming people into relationship with him and into the relationship with each other. And that the way that he does it is through inviting people to relinquish their power and the manipulation. Even in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, where we see Jesus encouraging us to not worry, to not be anxious about our life, what he's doing is he's inviting us to relinquish power over our own life, to let go of the control. And when we judge each other, it's just an effort to manipulate. We're just trying to get people to do what we want them to do. And he's saying, don't do that. That's not the way we do it. He's constantly in this process of laying down power. Think with me, even in the Passion narrative, where Jesus is riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Right? They're ushering him in as king. They're waving palm branches, and he's riding in on a donkey from the east side of Jerusalem, and he's weeping. And at the same time, a whole garrison of Roman army is marching in from the west. And the picture we get is a picture of the powerless that becomes victorious over the powerful. Over and over again, we get this process of Jesus relinquishing power and inviting us into it. And here's the reality, is that we don't really get it. And, I find actually a lot of comfort in the reality that the people who were with Jesus the most and lived with him for 3 years, they actually didn't really get it either. Does that encourage anybody? Jesus even says it himself. He says, seriously? I've been with you for 3 years, and how long must I be with you? We get James and John, I think it's in Mark chapter 10. They're arguing over who's going to sit at Jesus' right and who's going to sit at Jesus' left. Because what they think is about to happen is that the Messiah is going to rise to power. It's going to overthrow the Romans, and they're just kind of vying for position. And so I find it kind of strangely comforting, much more comforting than what's going on right here. I'm sorry, buddy. Maybe. We'll work it out. We'll figure it out. I'm just trying to make you feel better, man. I'm going to be fine. But I just find it really comforting that these guys who were around Jesus and he's walking this out with him in everyday life, they're bickering over who is going to sit at his right and left. He's got to be like, oh, man. Or he's in the Garden of Gethsemane and, people come to take him. What does Peter do? He whips out the sword and he chops a guy's ear off. And I just gotta imagine that Jesus is seriously, dude. That's not the way the kingdom is coming. 3 years these men and women spent around Jesus. I actually think the women got it, to be honest with you. That's probably a different sermon. It's probably a different teaching. But if you read the story, I actually think the women got it. And I think that's actually part of the goodness of the kingdom that we see, that if you read between the lines and you kind of read through the cultural context of what's unfolding in the New Testament, I think the women really got it. And, I didn't plan on saying this, but I actually think, there's this deep sense in me over the past couple of years that the future of the church is going to be led by women. And I don't know what the landscape is up here in Canada. I see some of you cheering. That's good, right? But, I just want to say that if you're a woman and you are questioning what role you have to play in the life of the church, I just want to say you've got it. You've got whatever it takes to lead. And if there's ever any question about that, you can give me a call, and I would love to chat with you about that because I have a real passion for releasing women into leadership. So, yeah, amen, right? Thank you. So, if we had a slide, what the slide would say is a passage from Matthew chapter 5, this main passage that I have been focusing on in my life of recently. And it's this phrase that Jesus gives us. He says, give to everyone who asks of you. Give to everyone who asks of you. It's right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Oh, man, you're amazing. Thank you. Look, there it is. I told you. Give this guy a hand right here, man. Oh, is that right? Okay, it's okay. It's in French anyway, so we'll be fine. Though probably some of you speak French, so forgive me. Give to everyone who asks of you, says Jesus. And I've been really wrestling with this command of Jesus. And I got to be honest with you, even after putting this in its rightful historical context and thinking about what this meant in that present moment and what it might mean to me and to my life, as I reflect on this teaching, as I try to imagine engaging in this kind of behavior, in my best and most courageous moments, I got to tell you that I still am working on trying to figure out what this looks like articulated out in my life. And so because of that, because sometimes when we don't understand something, we kind of hold it off at a distance, my honest assessment of this process in my life is that I'm not quite sure how to articulate this in my life. I'm not quite sure how to lean into this particular teaching. But as I was thinking and praying just a little bit about our time tonight, what I sensed God's invitation to me to do with you is to invite you a little bit in on the process of my thinking and the process of what it's been like for me to try to take seriously this teaching of Jesus. I shared with you this morning that one of the questions that I've been holding over the past couple of years is, how do I become the kind of person who can follow the way of Jesus? And I think that as I've reflected on this, what I've recognized is that I can't become the kind of person unless I first try to follow in the way of Jesus. That there's this process, is that as I step out and as I try, that I actually get formed into becoming the kind of person that's able to continue to follow Jesus. Does that make sense? I think we get stuck in our Bible study, in our devotional life, thinking that we can somehow study our way into obedience to Jesus. I think it's actually that we obey our way into being obedient to Jesus. I think we just try. And so the new kind of question that I'm noticing, the new thing that I'm reflecting upon is, who am I becoming as I practice following the way of Jesus? This is my new question. It's no longer a how-to question. It's now a reflective question. As I step back and I watch my life of practicing and following Jesus, what do I notice about myself? And what do I notice about my relationship with God as I step out in faith and I try to practice following the way of Jesus? You see the difference there? I remember when my daughter first learned to start playing the guitar. How many of you have had a child learn how to play an instrument? Anybody? God bless you. Man, so many of you, right? It's excruciating in some ways, depending on the instrument. If it's like a trumpet or a trombone or, God forbid, the drums. Right? That lasted for like a couple of weeks at our house, to be honest with you. But I remember when she first started trying to learn to play the guitar, you got little hands, and even though it's a little guitar, it's complicated. And it's been a great process for her. She started with the violin, she switched to the guitar. And I remember having this conversation with her this one day where she was crying, she was frustrated. She wasn't getting it right. She wasn't able to make the thing sound the way it was supposed to sound. And I said, well, what's going on? Like, why are you frustrated? And she says, well, I want to be able to play the guitar. I said, I understand that. I think that's kind of why you're getting lessons and why you're practicing. She says, but I don't want to practice. I just want to play it. Right? And I was like, well, I get it. It's just not how it works. Like, the only way to get to be the kind of person that can pick up the guitar and play music is that you have to practice in order to learn how to play. And I think our life with Jesus is the same way. I don't think that we think about it that way, do we, though? We don't think about following Jesus or trying to be obedient to the Sermon on the Mount as like, I'm just going to go practice. I'm just going to go practice. And if I make mistakes and if I fail, it's fine. It's part of the learning process. But look at the life of the disciples, like what I just shared about James and John and Peter. They were just practicing. And Jesus still kind of welcomed them. Think about Peter, living with Jesus, loving, I'm going to follow you to the end. And then in a moment of practice, a moment of opportunity, he completely denies Jesus. But it's not like Jesus takes away his guitar, right? It's like he hands him a Fender, right? It's like, you messed up this play guitar in a really bad way, but here's a brand new guitar for you. Here's the keys to the kingdom. I'm going to build my church on you. So those of you who are paying attention, like fastidiously taking notes, those of you linear thinkers, I told you this morning that this evening I wanted to focus on two questions: is what are some intentional ways to cultivate this kind of life? This kind of life that we see reflected in the Sermon on the Mount. And what does this kind of life produce? And I want to just start by saying that we practice. We just practice. And as I have practiced trying to live my life into this one particular teaching, give to everyone who asks of you. As I have practiced that, what I've noticed, and we touched on this a little bit this morning, is that everything in my life, every context in my life is bending me in the complete opposite direction. Like everything. Just this past week, I'd spent last week, I was gone for 7 days from my wife and family, which doesn't happen often. And my wife and I have a date. We have a lunch date every Wednesday or every Monday. Sometimes we just go for a walk. Sometimes we go to our favorite restaurant. And this past Monday, we went to our favorite restaurant. And I know that across the street from my favorite restaurant is this kind of corner where a number of homeless people kind of hang out. And what I noticed that on Monday, because I missed my wife, and because we were on our way to the date, what I noticed is that as we headed to the restaurant, I crossed to the other side of the street to avoid that corner for fear that someone was going to ask me for something, and then it would be upon me to try to be obedient to the thing that I'm trying to practice. Like that was going through my mind, right? And so, does that story remind you of like anything? Like it reminds you of a story that Jesus tells about what not to do. Like the story of the Good Samaritan. Like I literally crossed the street to avoid that situation. That doesn't look good. So, dude, you do it, man. This is great. I love it. I'm going to quote Anita right here. We're family. This is great. So, I share that story with you is because I've been thinking about that story. And I don't want you to, don't get concerned about me. I don't take it on as shame. I don't have a codependent bone in my body any longer. I've been through tons of counseling and therapy and lots of spiritual formation and direction. I don't feel compelled to go to that homeless corner out of a sense of I got to meet their needs and that kind of thing. But what has happened is as I've stepped out to try to implement this particular teaching of Jesus, what I notice is that what's happening in me is some wrestling and some conflict with it. But here's what I also notice, is that before I laid out the intention to try to walk out this teaching of Jesus, I never even noticed homeless people. It never came to my mind. But as I have engaged, and as I have tried to walk out this process of following Jesus, I can't get away from them. Does that make sense? Now it's on my radar. And I know that there's many of you in this room who have really lived your life into issues of mercy and justice, and you could probably speak for hours and hours about what I just described. But the question that has shifted for me is that as I watch myself interacting with the teaching of Jesus and trying it on, like a new shirt or an old shirt, what I notice about myself is that I am more deeply engaged in the life that follows after Jesus than I used to be. And I think that there's this process of trying it out. And so I want to do something right here in the middle for a second. I want you to close your eyes. Wait, ministry time in the middle? That's right. I want you to just open your hands. For me, the thing that Jesus has invited me into is to give to everyone who asks of you. And I don't want to put that on you. I don't know what Jesus is doing in your life, but I want you to take a moment and begin to think and reflect, what is something, Jesus, that I could begin to practice in my following of you? What is that for you? What have you sensed in your life that Jesus is inviting you into? And what are the forces around you that are pushing you in the opposite direction? These aren't always evil forces. It's not always sin. I mean, sometimes it's like busyness, tiredness, binge watching Netflix, whatever it is for you. What's preventing you from beginning to step out in a kind of practicing way to one thing that Jesus is inviting you into? Okay, now I just want you to tuck that away and save that for later. That process of just coming to Jesus and just saying, Jesus, what is it that you want me to begin practicing? It's always there. And I just would invite you to take on this posture every single day. Just, Lord, what are you inviting me into today to practice? And what you'll recognize, and I'm sure that something came to your mind in that moment, is that the forces around you are pressing you in the complete opposite direction. That cultural forces and technological forces and Netflix forces, I think I mentioned that, they're all pushing us in the opposite direction of the thing that Jesus is inviting us into. And in the early church, there was a movement of people that began to notice that the way of the church had begun to be influenced in this pressure kind of way negatively. That what was happening in the life of the early church is that it was shifting and that it was changing, and that the kind of the forces of power in the Roman Empire were beginning to press upon the life of the early church. And in the mid-4th century, there was a small pocket of men and women who began to recognize that the central features of the Christian witness were kind of beginning to crumble. In this excellent book here called A Patient Ferment, scholar Alan Kreider tells the story of the first 300 or so years of the church, and he makes the case that the posture of the early church actually looked like the life of Jesus. That there was this kind of relinquishment of power. There was this way of humility. He says this, the Christians believed that God is patient and that Jesus visibly embodied patience. And they concluded that they, trusting in God, should be patient, not controlling events, not anxious or in a hurry, and never using force to achieve their ends. He goes on to describe the first 300 years of the church and how this posture of patience really shaped the way that they worshiped and the way that they engaged life with the people around them. So much so that in the first 300 years, there were 3 major treatises on patience. 3 major papers, effectively, major books. That the life of the early church was so rooted in the life of patience. And he notes that there was not one kind of articulation about discipleship or evangelism or church growth, but all of it was rooted in the life of patience. He goes on to say this. He says, the early Christians had a perspective that they called patience. So they were not surprised that the church's growth was uneven, that there were certain areas where there were concentrations of Christians and other areas where there were no believers at all. Christian leaders didn't think or write about how to systematize the spread of Christianity. They weren't concerned to cover the world evenly with evangelistic efforts. Instead, Christians concentrated on developing practices that contributed to what is called a habitus, which is just a form of habits. That they formed the habits of their life in a particular way that characterized both individual Christians and Christian communities. They believed that when the habitus, when the practices were healthy, that the church would grow. Their theology was unhurried. It was a theology of patience. That if our practices are healthy, the church will grow. So what happened? Well, in 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. He made Christianity the state religion, and what was a marginal group of people who were following Jesus at risk of their lives, constantly at risk at being thrown to the lions, right? People around, they began to recognize that these are the people that cared for the poor. What began to happen is that once Constantine rose to power and he made Christianity a state religion, what happened is much of that witness of patience and humility and long-suffering began to dwindle away from the church. And this was during a time when becoming or being a Christian was illegal until Constantine. And what began to happen is the Roman Empire and the church began to kind of work together. They began to get in bed together. And church began to be corrupted by the powers of the empire and the violence. So much so that even Augustine, one of the doctors of the early church, one of the greatest theologians that we have, began to rely on the power of Rome to solve theological disputes in the church. And it was against this backdrop that some men and women basically resisted the power and said, that's not the way of Jesus. We're going to go do something else. And so they went out into the middle of the desert and they lived in caves and they began to form counter-formational communities. That by the 5th century, we get something in the rule of St. Benedict that began to provide some structure to how these communities oriented their lives together. How do we relinquish power and follow the way of Jesus when everything around us is forming us in the opposite direction? And I would just maybe submit to you that the church has been here before. And that there were men and women that provided a prophetic witness of how to relinquish that power and how to live in a different way. A lot of scholars agree upon a way of labeling what happened in the early 4th century as the Constantinian error. Did you guys know this? Did you guys know that the early church was like rooted low to the ground? And then we got power. And what came after that? Lots of grabbing for land, lots of killing people, crusades, all that kind of stuff. But even since then, there has been this prophetic witness of men and women who related in a very different way. And the thing that they formed their life around was humility. The whole structure of their life began to pay close attention to our relationships with one another and how we can pursue a humble life together. How we can pursue a life that relinquishes the power. About 5 or 6 years ago, actually 6 or 7 years ago, I began to sense a call to plant a church. And I had begun looking in the Pacific Northwest. So we had plans to go out to Portland, Oregon, and Eugene, Oregon, and a couple other cities like Seattle. And every time I thought and prayed about the kind of church that I wanted to plant, the thing that God had put on my mind looked so much more like a monastery and a religious order than anything else. And so I got really confused because I'm a part of the vineyard. But what began to happen over a course of 4 or 5 years in a series of prophetic words and just powerful encounters with the Lord is that slowly the Lord began to invite me in this really strange and odd way to consider modeling my life and my faith community after the life of these men and women who went out into the desert. Now, I don't think that we need to go out into the desert to learn what these men and women learned. But I do think that they needed to. And that what they did for us is that they cultivated something really deep that we can learn from. And so in our time left together, I want to just share with you a couple practical things about how to cultivate this way of Jesus and what happens to us as we do, and specifically where to look for it in our lives. I believe that God is presently doing something in the vineyard. I really do. And I believe that it has something to do with cultivating a deep and inner life. That perhaps in the same way that God used the vineyard as a renewal and a prophetic movement for worship that gifted the entire church, that I believe that this is our next assignment. And that's just me talking. I believe that we have a prophetic witness for the church about finding God in places of quiet and stillness, this contemplative life, a place of humility, of relinquishment of power. I was talking to Gordy earlier today, and we were kind of reflecting on, wow, I think the vineyard, we have like all the guts to kind of be a prophetic movement again, don't you think? I think God used the vineyard to really birth something, and I think he's going to do it again. And I think it's going to be in this relinquishment of power. Because what happens is that when we orient our lives around the teachings in Matthew chapter 5, when we recognize that it's not the external performance of moral obligations that God is concerned with, what happens is that we get in touch with the darkness and the frustration and all the stuff inside of us, and we get confronted with the deep darkness of our heart, and that births in us a sense of humility. When we relinquish power, what we get is humility. When we untangle our lives from the systems that try to manipulate, we end up entrusting our lives and other people's lives into the hands of God. Cyprian, who writes in about AD 250, says this, "Beloved brethren, we are philosophers not in words but in deeds. We exhibit our wisdom not by our dress but by our truth. We know virtues by their practice rather than through boasting of them. We do not speak great things, but we live them." You know, when I think about that story I told you about how I crossed the street to avoid, part of what I'm beginning to wonder, honestly, in those moments, hey, I'm spending time with my wife. I don't want to get involved in that. Like, what if those are just excuses? Like, honestly. Like, what if a whole movement of eradicating poverty and poverty of spirit is just on the other side of those excuses? What would happen if an entire, like hundreds of faith communities just took it seriously to give to everyone who asks? What would that look like? When it's not just on one or two people who are trying to but if all Christians everywhere engaged in this radical divestment of power, what would happen? What if the abundant life that Jesus promises is just on the other side of us practicing walking out the teachings of Jesus? When we begin to do that, we start to feel a little different, because we start to bump up against the limits that we experience when we try to do it. There's this sense of like I just shared with you, I crossed the other side of the street. That's humbling. Isaac the Syrian says, "It is neither asceticism nor vigils nor other work which saves us, only sincere humility. Without humility, works are of no profit. What salt is to food, humility is to the virtues. But without humility, all of our works are in vain. Indeed, all of our virtues and all of our asceticism." The resistance to power for these men and women who were trying to fight against this pushing in the other direction, it got expressed in humility. So, oftentimes people think humility is just a sense of weakness. They think it's kind of this I just need to push back a little bit. Oh, I don't need to exert myself at all. But in reality, humility is a little different. The Greek word here is tapeinos. It is a state of abasement. It's a sense of going low. It's a sense of being low to the ground. Or the Latin here, humilitas or humus. We get the word the stuff of the earth, low to the ground, the condition in which one finds oneself flatly on the ground. How many have experienced that? I like to put it like this, is to see our weakness and not have it bother us. That's humility. Is to see where we're struggling and to just be okay with it. So a couple places to be on the lookout for humility, and this is kind of gleaned by looking at the early church fathers and mothers, the desert fathers and mothers, some Eastern Orthodox theologians. I've just tried to highlight 3 places to watch out for an opportunity to lean into the relinquishment of power and to notice where God's invitation towards humility might be. And I want to start here, is that humility is learned in the concrete realities of our everyday life. The concrete realities of our everyday life. There's a short film clip here. We're not going to get the sound, but it's okay because there's subtitles. The subtitles are in English. How many of you read English? Awesome. This is a film called Of Gods and Men. It's about the monks of Tiberine in the mid-1990s. These were some French monks in the mountains of Algeria. And what's that? Oh, stop it for a second, sorry. No biggie. You did, sir.
It's playing the audio just through the
Good.
wireless.
That's amazing. Way to go, man. All right, so back that up for a second. So basically what's going on in this, it's a very short clip, but there's just a moment here I want you to capture. I want you to see. And then you can go see the movie because it's a must-see film, by the way. How many of you have seen this film? It's so good. Like, I watch it every single year. So what's going on, it's called Of Gods and Men. And these are monks in Algeria, and what's happened is the entire kind of town around them becomes surrounded by Muslim extremists of the time. And they're threatening the monks. And there's this kind of weighty decision throughout the whole film. I'm not going to give anything away. But the decision basically is, should we stay and face the danger of what's happening, or should we go? And should we leave? Should we go back to France? Should we resettle there? And I hope you can read it. I know that it's a little fuzzy, but I want you to pay attention to the guy in the middle, his face. He's the abbot of the community. Go ahead, David. So they're basically in this environment where they end up saying to him, we didn't elect you to decide on your own. Did you see his face? I don't know if you could see it, but his face was kind of like he's all like ramped up, and he's like trying to push a decision through the process. He's trying to decide for everyone that they should stay. And this is back and forth, and you can see he's kind of hardened, and then do you see the old man who almost spoke, and then he's like, it's not worth it anymore. We've just tried 4 or 5 times to get through to you, and now I'm not going to say anything. But eventually, this guy Luke, he says, we didn't elect you to decide on your own. And the facial expression there. How many of you have ever had that moment where you think that you are right, and you keep walking this direction, and then somebody reveals to you that, wow, you're really making a mistake? Have you ever had that moment? Those of you who are married or have children or have ever dated anybody or have ever had a job, we think that we learn the spiritual goodness in our Bibles. And listen, that is a place where God speaks to us. But I want to just encourage you to look for the invitation towards humility and the way of Jesus in the everyday concrete realities of your life. The decisions, the parenting, the husbanding and wifing, the teaching at your local school or whatever context you're in, the making of cappuccinos, wherever you are, there are things happening around you in the everyday concrete realities of your life that are invitations for you to consider what the humble approach to that would be. And oftentimes it comes, not always, but it oftentimes comes in the moment where you're making a mistake. And those of you who don't make mistakes, you're going to have to look for it other places. He won't let me advance beyond this. Hold on a second. Okay. St. Bernard says, without concrete abasement, there can be no humility. In the Latin, it actually says, without concrete moments of humiliation, there can be no humility. And so what often happens is that when we experience humiliation, when we experience what this guy experienced, what we often try to do is we shut it down because it's painful, right? When we've made a mistake, we kind of run in the opposite direction and we pretend that the mistake that we made doesn't exist. But what the invitation seems to me to be is to stand here and look at it and to receive it for the instruction that it is. This is what the desert fathers and mothers have taught us. The second place is that humility is learned in relationships. How many of you are in relationship with somebody? Great, there's multiple opportunities then. I had this experience about a year ago with one of my daughters. She was probably 8 or 9 years old, and what I noticed is that there were a couple times where she would just get completely overwhelmed, like out of the blue, and she would start to cry, or she would like run out of the room. And what didn't well up in me was compassion. For some reason, I didn't at that moment have any compassion on her. I actually felt frustration. Because it would be disruptive, and it would just, honestly, like as I reflect back on it and as I've thought about it, it just made me feel uncomfortable. That's what was happening. But there was this one time, and this kept happening over and over again, and there was this one time that I saw she ran into her room, and something shifted in me, and I began to follow her into her room where she was lying on her bed crying. And so I just kind of crawled up onto her bed with her, and I just began to say, hey, what's going on? And I still felt a little tinge of frustration, probably a little judgment. And she so eloquently, for a 9-year-old, begins to explain to me, she says, Dad, sometimes everything around me starts feeling really loud. It's like all of the sounds are coming in at once, and it makes me feel overwhelmed. And as she's telling that, what I began to realize was that I have the same experience. And that as a child, I often had that same experience. And listening to her and engaging in that relationship with her, it's like my chest was pounded with an appropriate sense of, wow, I completely missed it. So I comforted her, and I said, hey, why don't you just hang out here for a little bit? And I proceeded to go into the kitchen, and I just like literally sat on the floor and wept. Because what she was able to reveal to me is that I actually had the same experience. In your relationships with others, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature of God, did not regard equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant and being made in the human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. We can learn humility in relationships. Humility is learned in relationships. Saint Brene Brown, you guys know? She says this: compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Do you see that? It's that leveling out. Only when we know our own darkness, through accepting our whole story, can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. Sounds like Philippians 2, doesn't it? That there's this leveling effect that we can enter into in relationships, but when we approach relationships like this, there's no humility and we can't learn it. We can't find the relationship. What Jesus demonstrates for us is I am willing to come down. And what I was missing in this instance with my daughter is that for the longest time, I wasn't willing to come down. But when I finally did, she taught me something. Does that make sense? It happens in the concrete realities of our everyday life. It happens through relationships. A brother at Cetus committed a fault. A council was called to which Abba Moses was invited, but he refused to go to it. Then the priest sent someone to him saying, "Come, for everyone is waiting for you." And so he, the Abba, got up and he went, and he took a leaking jug, filled it with water, and carried it with him. Okay, get that picture in your mind, a leaking jug. The others came out to meet him and said to him, "What is this, Father?" The old man said to them, "My sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I'm coming to judge the error of another." And when they heard that, they said no more to the brother, but forgave him. As you imagine your life going to confront somebody, going to accuse somebody, going to judge somebody, picture that you have a leaky jug that is leaking out behind you. Your sins run out behind you, and yet you are going to judge another. It happens in relationship. And unless we are willing to confront the reality of the sin and the darkness in our own life, we have no business going to do that to other people. This is Jesus' teaching. First, remove the plank out of your own eye so that you can see the speck of sawdust in your brother. It's not that you're actually going to remove the plank and then therefore go and inspect the sawdust. You know, that's not the teaching, right? The idea is that when you look at your own plank, you're just like, I don't even care about my brother's sawdust because this thing hurts really bad. Humility is learned in relationships. And humility is learned in temptation. How many of you have ever been tempted? Awesome, man. We're like 3 for 3 tonight. How many of you ever succumbed to temptation? Rest of you, like, whose hands aren't up? No? Okay. Okay, awesome. Okay. We have a lot in common here. There's this theme running through the wisdom literature of the desert fathers and mothers that suggests that one of the most prevalent places we learn how to follow Jesus is through our temptation and even in our sin. If we look back at Matthew chapter 4, at the end of it, it says that the Spirit of God drove Jesus into the wilderness where he was tempted. And the temptation in the desert is, of course, to rely on his own power and his own strength, to take care of his own needs by turning the stone into bread. He's tempted to have immediate power when he's taken up to the height of the temple. Imagine that there's hundreds of people surrounding the temple court, and the enemy takes him up to the temple and says, "Throw yourself off. What's going to happen?" An angel will come down and swoop. And that's probably what would happen, right? Well, what would happen next? If a man jumps off a tower and an angel comes down from the sky and swoops to save him, what would happen next? Immediately, everyone would fall and worship. So what was being offered to Jesus in this moment was a quick trip to having all of the power. He takes him to the highest cliff and he says, "All of this belongs to me. This entire kingdom will be yours if you just bow down to me." And Jesus obviously says no, but the temptation was to give to Jesus the thing that was actually rightfully already his. There is an opportunity within our temptation to step back and notice, what is the enemy after right here? What are the ways that the deceiver is trying to prevent me from following the way of Jesus? Throughout the church mothers and fathers, we get this idea that there is a goodness in our weakness. There's a goodness there. We say with the Apostle Paul that I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses and in my hardships and in the insults and the persecutions, for when I am weak, then I am strong. St. Cassian says we must ourselves learn to feel in each action both our weakness and the help of God, and to proclaim daily with the saints, I was hard pressed and was falling, but the Lord helped me. My strength and my courage is the Lord, and he has been my helper and my Savior. Can I just say that when you feel temptation, when you succumb to temptation, the response to that is not to feel bad. The response to that is to stand under the grace and mercy of God and let it drench you. That's humility. To see the weakness and to not let it bother you. And I'm not trying to make light of sin here, but the writer of Hebrews tells us that when we look at the throne of grace, that we should approach the throne of grace with confidence to help us in our time of need. And oftentimes, I don't know how it is with you, but when I find myself succumbing to temptation, my approach to the throne of grace looks more like this. Kind of cautious. But the writer of Hebrews says, get up there to the throne of grace, get what you need, and just get on with it. That there's this process of looking at our life in the moment of temptation and in the moment of sin, and we get to the point where we say, I don't have what it takes to face the thing that is facing me, and so I rely on the grace and the love and the mercy of Jesus. That's what humility is. What our response to sin and failure reveals will tell you a lot about yourself. Oftentimes, we are more frustrated when we sin that we're not the person that we thought we were than we are frustrated about the fact that we have not done the right thing. We have this picture in our mind of who we want to be, and when we fail to be that person, we're actually more afraid of admitting that we're not where we want to be than we are saddened by the fact that we have disobeyed something. Father Richard Rohr says this. He says, the more you are attached to any persona or mask, good or bad, any chosen and preferred self-image, the more shadow self you will have. So we absolutely need conflicts, relational difficulties, moral failures. We need defeats and we need enemies, or we will have no way to ever spot or track our shadow self, which is the log in our own eye. Your shadow is not evil. Your temptation is not evil. It's just the part of yourself that you don't want to see. The unacceptable self by reason of culture, nature, nurture, and choice. Ongoing shadow boxing is necessary because we all have a well-denied shadow self that threatens to destroy our public and personal self-image. Seeing your own log first is necessary to stop blaming, accusing, and denying, and thus displacing the problem. It is about seeing truthfully and fully, which is called the mirror process. There is the great task for a man, says Abba Anthony, to accept in himself his sin before God and expect temptation until he takes his last breath. How many of you have a struggle that has been going on for decades? It's okay, you can raise your hand. I'm raising mine. What if it never goes away? Here's what I would say to you. God is going to use it in your life to create a greater sense of dependence upon Him. Humility is when we take the mask off and we just say, you know what, God, I come to you as I truly am. With no pretense and no pretending. This is who I am and my failures. I'm the guy that crossed on the other side of the street to avoid the homeless guy. And you love me. And you're drawing me close. Close your eyes with me again, and we just reach out your hands like this. We learn humility in concrete reality of our lives. We learn it in relationships, and we learn it through our temptation. Just take a moment and think through those three contexts. Come, Holy Spirit. I think for some of you right now, the Lord is going to bring a concrete situation to your mind right now. And for those of you who had a concrete situation come to your mind, as we continue to sit quietly, I want you to just invite God to speak to you about that. God, what is in this situation that you would have me consider? For others of you, there's a particular specific relationship that God is going to bring to your mind right now, that you know is a place that the invitation is to go low, and you feel resistance to that. Just come, Holy Spirit. And there's others of you that are nagged by temptation. And the enemy is taunting you with it. What is that for you? Picture the enemy and the way that he taunts you. Notice it. And in the power and authority of Jesus, tell the enemy to go away. Just command all accusation to go away right now. Just command all kind of mounting sense of guilt at failure to go away right now. Because when the guilt and the whispering voice of the enemy is away, you can sit with what's left, which is you and God, and you can begin to talk to God about this besetting temptation of your life. There is something there for you. What you resist in temptation is not the temptation. What you resist is the enemy. Tell it to go away. And then sit and just be honest with the Lord right now. Just say, God, I'm tempted by this. What's going on there? Meet me in my weakness. Let's come, Holy Spirit. Now, as I was praying yesterday, I just got a sense that God wants to actually bring some freedom to some of you tonight. In concrete situations, in relationships that are fraught with power dynamics, and in temptation where the enemy is at work, whispering lies into your ear. And so, if there is something that's coming to your mind that you just really sense that the Spirit is inviting you to just confront right now, you don't have to. It's up to you. Would you just stand and the people around you would pray for you? Could you do that? Just begin to stand up right now where you are. If one of these areas has come to your mind, a concrete situation in your life, a relationship that is kind of fraught with power dynamics that you just can't seem to get away from, that you know that God is inviting you to go low in, and a temptation where the enemy is whispering in your ear, just begin to stand if the Lord has brought something to your mind.